Hey, you guys, it's Chappie from Task Force 70. I'm super excited today. We have Stefano on, who's a cartel expert. And today's episode, we're mostly focusing on uh, the TF70 size department and how they most commonly interact with cartel operations and how they can identify them for what they are when it's possible. It's not always possible, but we also want to talk about, we're not going to get too much in the weeds on the large scale national issue with cartel operations in the United States, which is obviously a giant problem. But I do want you guys to learn a little bit about that at the high level because it's important at the small agency level when we interact with them. And there's few better experts on cartel operations than the gentleman that we're bringing on right now. Stefano, do you mind introducing yourself real quick and talking to folks about yourself?
Yes. Hello. Well, first of all, Joe, thank you so much for having me. My name is Stefano Ritondale. I go also by All Source News on my social media. I'm active on X, formerly known as Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all the socials, Blue Sky. My focus is, as you mentioned, is Mexican cartels, really from an open source intelligence perspective. Really where I try to focus on is tracking them on their social medias. We can get to that. Cartel members are very active on social media.
Oh, yes.
Tracking them there. It's a project, it's an account I created about almost 5 years ago. Kind of started out as a hobby and then really became something that I really try to specialize and become much more professional. Had the opportunity to be interviewed by multiple news agencies, had conversations in conferences, governments, et cetera, to really kind of educate people on the cartels. And my other role is also I'm the chief intelligence officer of Artorias. Artorias is an AI data collection and intelligence analysis company. We have an app called SitRep, and we leverage AI to do with our own scrapers, collect, analyze, and disseminate information for any topic around the world, either security, law enforcement, intelligence, finance, environmental concerns, you name it. Anything that requires large data collections and analysis, that's what we want to focus on. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here because I think, as you alluded to, a lot of times when we're talking about cartels, we either try to oversimplify or maybe we focus on the forest. And there's a lot of details that really need to get down, and it's applicable to any agencies, however big or small. So great opportunity to talk. So thank you so much.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you and your time. I know how busy you are, and I know that especially the cops watching this are going to get a lot out of it, and hopefully they follow you. I have for quite a while, and you are a phenomenal analyst. So
Thank you.
hopefully guys will start tracking you. So let's start. If you can give us a large read, kind of the forest level, like you talked about. I know that your highest level of specialty is how they interrelate with one another online in their host environment. But I'm interested mostly for the small agency cops, the large scale picture of how they are operating on the ground in the United States, how those groups are functioning with not just cartel members, but utilizing members of the public, how that's working on the ground inside the country.
So let's start big, right? So I think first and foremost, it's really important when we're talking about Mexican cartels, it's first very important to highlight that a lot of times when I say the oversimplifications, they just kind of throw the label cartels. It's kind of this magic wand. And in reality, there are dozens of groups that are active in Mexico that can kind of fit that mold. From anything very large cartels, for example, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, to very small ones down in other parts of Mexico. For example, the Telacos is a perfect example down in Guerrero, right? Various degrees. And I think what are the key aspects, right? You have the Trump administration declared 6 of them foreign terrorist organizations: the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Sinaloa Cartel, Gulf Cartel, the Northeast Cartel, the United Cartel, and Nueva Familia Michoacana, like the new Familia Michoacana family, right? The key aspect when we're analyzing cartels from a Mexican perspective inside of Mexico is that it's defined really by these cartels trying to gain territorial control. And a lot of times the main rivals of cartels is another cartel, right? That generally is what you see. Yes, sometimes they battle the government, but a lot of times it's more battling each other and battling these rival cartels for specific territorial control. And then the government, either they fight them or they leverage them from corruption. And then sometimes you have very weird scenarios where one specific area, you might have the federal government being supporting one cartel, but the state government may be another. And it's kind of this very convoluted issue. And so that's what we see in Mexico. And that's kind of where the videos, if you look at my account, like these up armored vehicles, the drones, these like fighting, that kind of reminiscence more of Iraq and Afghanistan, necessarily than more the gang violence, let's say in the United States, like Chicago or all these other cities, right? It's a kind of different battle that you see in Mexico. And it kind of updates our lexicon when we're analyzing Mexican cartels. I actually wrote an article for a think tank, Newsline Institute, about that. When you're looking at from the United States perspective, though, in cartel presence in the United States, it's a different business model, it's a different model of operations. In other words, what you see in the United States is they are basically much more focused on what we would consider transactional cartels, the business aspect of the drug trafficking or other trafficking, right? It could be anything. And so in the United States, you won't necessarily see the same situation in Mexico, right? And so when I try to give like a general answer, like what to your mind would you imagine cartel presence in the United States? Yes, you have the gunmen, the sicarios, and all that, but that's not the prevalent focus of them inside the business. What would it be? It's the infrastructure needed to run a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Your lawyers, your fronts, your businesses to launder money, your financial institutions, key individuals for trafficking. Most of the times, if not almost entirely U.S. citizens, right? That they leverage to do it. And that's generally the bias of operation when we're talking about cartels in the United States. It's that transactional business model to make money and sell a product, either drugs, human smuggling, or a wide range of other goods that are not necessarily illegal, for example, oil or avocados. And then in Mexico is that territorial battle between different rights, right? And again, one of the comparisons that I used for people to understand, if you wanted the best example of cartels, these are two examples I would say. The one I would say is, the first one is basically imagine Amazon and Blackwater, the private military company, merged into one, right? The Amazon aspect of sending products, sending goods to people, etc., and then the Blackwater because of that territorial control inside of Mexico. That kind of is what the cartel is. And then in relations to the United States, what I would tell people, think of it more as like a shipping container company, like, for example, Maersk. Maersk is this huge maritime company with hundreds of container ships around the world at a given time. But what is their focus? Is to get a product from one country, let's say Shanghai, to the port of Los Angeles, right? But once it gets to LA, it's generally a different company that then moves it to somewhere else, right? A trucking company, a tree. But that's not necessarily Maersk's responsibility. In many ways, that's how the cartels operate, right? Their goal is, we need to send quantity of a product, large scale, to a destination in the United States, but then either through existing business relationships with local crime groups, gangs, or organized crime families, or separate ways, the people, they give them the drugs or the product, and then it's that responsibility of that gang or that local trafficker to then give it at the street level, right? You're not going to see, never say never, but you're never going to see really a Sinaloa cartel member in the streets selling drugs directly. Right. That's generally not how they're going to do. Their job is to get the large quantity of it into the United States, or even at sometimes they might even have their own drug laboratory inside the United States that then they kind of produce it. And we've actually seen that model in Europe, where they create their own drug laboratories and they just send the precursors of whatever drug they want, not only fentanyl, like cocaine or methamphetamines. And then from there, from that drug laboratory, they make sure the infrastructure in place, the drug lab is set. And then from there, then they just distribute it to their local people and their gangs to then give it to the consumer. And so that's kind of like a brief or overview of how you would generally see Mexican cartels operate inside the United States compared to inside of Mexico.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So they are a manufacturer, and they develop these relationships with existing American crime organizations in order to do the actual distribution. And as it comes back, it seems to me, based on some conversations you and I have had before, that the cartels themselves, who like you said, are not a monolithic organization. They're multiple cartels. Their primary lift inside the United States, outside of some of the smaller scale, but probably increasing manufacture inside the United States, their primary lift, though, is money laundering and exiting or exfilling resourcing
Mm-hmm.
is primarily what they're doing. It's why what interactions the state agencies are having with cartels are generally involving cash,
Mm-hmm.
because the primary lift for them is taking control of the proceeds and then exfilling those. Would that be a fair way of
I think
putting it?
that's a great way, because another way I would say is, so when you're looking at, for example, fentanyl, right,
Mhm.
and methamphetamines, I think you're right. Like the manufacturing, that a lot of that is done, depending on, again, each cartel is different.
Mhm.
So, and then that's where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. So, for example, the Sinaloa cartel has a lot of the methamphetamine base out of Durango, so they can produce their own
Mhm.
methamphetamine and they send it to the U.S. But other cartels, for example, the Northeast cartel doesn't have the territorial control where drug production is done. But what they do control is the border areas between Mexico and the United States. So they get a slice of the profits, enabling
Right.
them to use their territory to ship the drugs. And that's actually a relationship we know that exists. A specific faction of the Sinaloa cartel called Maito Flaco, and the Northeast cartel, which is based out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas,
Mhm.
which borders Laredo, Texas. CDN, the Northeast cartel, a lot of the drugs that they use that get smuggled through that area actually comes from Maito Flaco, the Sinaloa,
Mhm.
that business relationship. So you do see that. But for example, cocaine, where the cartels actually, where the cocaine really, because in Mexico they don't really produce cocaine. That's all
Mhm.
mostly done in Colombia, and I know now in the news it's a lot of Venezuela, right? So
Mhm.
like it's the same with the Venezuelan military, Cartel de los Soles. Like Venezuela doesn't necessarily produce the cocaine. Most
Mhm.
Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. But what the Venezuelan military, which is called kind of the Cartel de los Soles or the Sun cartels, or the Mexican cartels, when they're dealing with cocaine, they just buy it mostly from Colombia, and they're kind of
Mhm.
like that managerial aspect of the logistics component of it,
Mhm.
how it's getting sent ultimately either to the United States or Europe, right? So
Mhm.
they buy it from there, and then either the groups there in Colombia through an existing relationship, or the Mexican cartels themselves are responsible for sending that drug ultimately to its end destination. And every case is different, but where you see these cartels is not necessarily the manufacturer of the drugs per se, which they
Mhm.
and they could have their own. They obviously have their own cocaine manufacturing down in Colombia, but a lot of times
Mhm.
there's others, these independent businesses, and the cartels feel that that manager perspective of the export
Mhm.
import pursuit. And to
Right.
recruitment in the United States, yes, right. Cash is a huge component. The other ones, it's drugs, and the other one that I think is also very important to look at is weapons,
Mhm.
right? Because Mexican, like over 70% of the guns seized inside of Mexico that are used by cartels have been traced back into the U.S., specifically
Mhm.
raw purchases from gun stores across the United States and gun manufacturers, right? And that's another important aspect. And a lot of these gunmen selling, a lot of people might assume that they mostly just come from gun stores along the border, which obviously they play a huge
Mhm.
role. But we do know of multiple, very complex weapon trafficking networks that span all the United States,
Mhm.
right? That then eventually leads its way into Mexico. And it's not right to just say it's in the border, it's across the US.
Mhm.
And they have those weapon smuggling networks that a lot of times obviously are not necessarily cartel themselves, but they have that existing business relationship
Mhm.
with those cartels. And the same with the human smuggling, right?
Right.
Smuggling, if you're looking at it from the border, a lot of times it's not necessarily the cartels who are doing it directly.
Mhm.
What they do have is the territory. And
Mhm.
so when the human smugglers want to operate in the plaza, a lot of these human smuggling networks are locally or family owned and
Mhm.
kind of run. And they pay a fee for the cartel to be able to leverage the plaza to push the people there. And then generally what you see is when they get to the US, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, it's actually a separate human smuggling network that is U.S. based that has a
Mhm.
relationship with the Mexican base. Some of the networks are cross borders. Some of them, it's like I'm giving you across, let's say El Paso. The moment you enter in El Paso, we did our job. If you want anything
Mhm.
further, you got to talk to these people. Let's say if you want to go to Spokane, Washington, right?
Right.
Okay, well then that's it. Here's that network over here that could help you get there, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's generally what the cartels in that aspect also is. They're not necessarily, a lot of times they're not necessarily the ones doing all the time the day-to-day
Mhm.
operations, but they're the ones that have a lot of that managerial and understanding from an import export aspect of
Mhm.
how to do it, either falsifying paperwork, making things have a veneer of legality.
Mhm.
Cash is the perfect example, because it's not easy to launder money. You need to have an
Right.
extensive network to do that. And we're talking about billions of dollars and money will happens in the US to enable these cartels and to get that cash back into Mexico in their own hands and control.
Right. And the cash is super important. The guns are important, and we'll talk about that when we get down to local law enforcement stuff, like how to identify um, whether these people are transporting dope up or people up or illegal material up or guns and cash down. Um, but I think it's super important for people to understand that especially when they're hearing something from large media about cartels, it's a way oversimplified, way over conglomerated understanding, because the vast majority of what we are going to encounter as law enforcement officers is the material, not the people.
Correct.
Right. So how do we I think it's critically important for no matter how small an agency is that they understand this basic foundation of information that you just gave us, because it helps us look for the right things,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of the dope arrests we make are going to be a gram or less. Vast majority of the cash that we seize is going to be $1,000 or less. But all of that adds up. And we're going to talk here in a moment about how to maximize those stops and those interactions to provide information to the people who are working the bigger cases. But one gun in a trunk on an arrest could be important, right? Where it came from, and where, more importantly, where it's going, right? The dope at the retail level is distributed by the gram. Guns and are pushed back one at a time. Like, they're not put into Connex boxes and shipped as giant shipments. They're done kind of one at a time, right? And it's the same. It's a little bit different with cash. Cash conglomerated inside the United States and laundered in a large way? Generally,
I've seen all, generally if they're going to get the money in the US and they launder it also in the US, we've known of many cases, and, the government has launched lawsuits and dozens, hundreds of businesses across the United States for exactly serving as a money laundering perspective into the United States. There was also reports of businesses related to sending money into Mexico being leveraged exactly for that. We know of crypto. So yes, a lot of that is also done in the United States because then it's easier. Once you launder the money and once it's in the U.S. financial sector, then you just do a transfer to somewhere else. But not, nobody's going to pay twice. And so, and that's the thing. And again, if you're looking at this from a small town perspective, it's to your point. Like, more than likely, your day-to-day operations, you're not going to run into a situation like that, right? Even scope or nothing like that. I don't want to think. And again, that's the thing, is because that's where I think that's the myth that needs to be kind of busted. Is this idea that the way cartels operate in the United States is not how they would operate in Mexico, and you're generally not going to see that in the United States. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have significant cases where that might actually happen, and you might get those big areas. And again, if you're even a small town, I mean, how many small towns are along major state highways, right? How do you think these cartels send large quantity of drugs? It's the interstate. And so that's where kind of the high intensity drug trafficking areas, the HIEDAs, play a huge role. And then and really, who would have the best understanding of the cartel situation in specific areas in the United States and where you're at is those high intensity drug trafficking areas, the HIEDA.
Correct.
Like, those are the ones that are going to have a better understanding, and that might enable local law enforcement to then have a better understanding of what do you might encounter in that region, in that area, whatever you see. And those are the types of conversations you might have, because you never know. Because Kansas City, for example, is also a major area for smuggling into the United States. Chicago. And generally, that's what you see, right? It's generally large urban centers because of obvious reason, because they're the most connected. That's where the most amount of money is probably exact. But again, there's also areas in other parts of the United States that also serves a purpose for money. And it goes into that network piece. Right. And again, it's okay. If we know of a Sinaloa cartel presence, for example, in Chicago, right. But we're seeing that Sinaloa cartel drugs that reached to Chicago because of a bus also made it to a town in, let's say, West Virginia. Okay, then that's where, okay, well, what's the network that they enabled to achieve that? And how was that? Is that a business dealing? Was it multiple layers before it went there? Is it a direct line? What's the crime syndicate or family
Mhm.
responsible for that? And that's kind of thing.
So it's interesting that you bring up the Haida connection because I think that's the number one intel source for small agencies. Almost every small agency lives within one or close to one. Uh, how important do you think, as an analyst? I know that a big majority of your work revolves around relationships within the networks, our side's networks. Um, do you view it as important as I do that small town officers, no matter how small the department, no matter how junior they are, that they start to develop those relationships within those types of organizations, not just HIDA, but it could be anything like large agencies that are within driving distance with their narcotics units or their gang units. Uh, what kind of information can an individual officer be asking about? Or, because I have a follow up to this regarding traffic stops, how important are those relationships?
Yeah, no, I think those are the critical aspect because in the end of the day,
Mhm.
those are the organizations that can really inform you. And more importantly, you can feed information to them.
Right.
Right? It's a two-way street. Now, granted, more than likely, if you're a small town, police department, more than likely you're
Mhm.
going to be receiving more information than your ability to give. Right? I mean, obviously, right? Because
Right.
worse, but that's fine. In the end of the day,
Mhm.
you're better informed and you have a better understanding because it kind of helps you have that understanding of what we're looking at, and that's the key aspect, right?
Mhm.
Is this a specific area where a specific gang, let's say, operates in an infrastructure, right? If you have cases of significant amount of drugs used in your town, how are they receiving those drugs? What are the connections and the
Mhm.
nexus to all that? And then that's how you can build a network, right? And that's in the end of the day,
Right.
the goal of every law enforcement agency to break up these drug trafficking networks or human smuggling networks, weapon smuggling networks. And I even said in the past, like, look, cartel members in Michoacan, if you look at Michoacan, one of the main reasons why it's super violent is because of avocados, because they fight for avocados,
Mhm.
but ship it into the United States. Again, it's one of those things that you just never know. And so I'm a true believer that Haidas are like a
Mhm.
perfect area to have an understanding of what's going on. Obviously, your federal agencies, your state agencies also have a lot to do with kind of tracking that. And then at
Mhm.
the end of the day, the more you're informed, the better you have it of an understanding of what is the thing you need to be looking at. Because from my perspective, again, I have a very I always say the tree, not the forest, and I focus a lot on the forest as your questions alluded to.
Mhm.
But I know of key indicators, but a lot of the key indicators that I kind of focus on are inside of Mexico, not
Right.
necessarily when they operate in the United States. And that takes a lot of finesse and understanding and years of this investigative work to have a better understanding. And in the end of the
Mhm.
day, those are the agencies that have that responsibility that do it. And if you can be a part of it, perfect. I would. You are better informed. And more importantly, you never know what type of information you have at your disposal that is a very high level interest to other organizations. I've seen that in
Mhm.
many capacities where I've been at, where somebody makes an off comment, hey, we saw X. And then somebody's like, that's very interesting because I'm all the way over here and I also saw that.
Mhm.
There you go.
Right.
That
Right.
simple dialogue, then that's how they discover a network.
Mhm.
They do
Exactly.
it all the time. And so don't believe because you're a small town cop that you don't necessarily have any information value to hire. And at a minimum, even if I say it's a very quiet area, at least you're knowing what's going around you, and it better informs your ability to then be able to
Mhm.
action further on this.
Yes, exactly. And the deeper you get into those networks, the more you understand what's interesting to them. In my experience, like arresting a dude with a bag of fentanyl may not. I mean, it's important, especially if he's moving it, not
Mhm.
using it, like because he's killing citizens of our jurisdiction. But if I've developed those relationships, I know far more detail about the things that are of interest to them. Like everything is as random as bagging to package material to who this guy, this guy deals with this guy. Just that fact could be critically important to them, but you won't know that unless you've developed that relationship with them
Exactly.
at some level. So, and even within regions, there are I've noticed this especially acutely here, where I am now in Middle Tennessee. There are different parts of Middle Tennessee that have not only different problems, but different target indicators for cartel involvement. Like one area here, it's Mexican restaurants. And nothing, I love eating Mexican food, and these are great restaurants, but they're pretty obviously money laundering schemes. Well, one county over, it's a whole different problem. It's equipment rental, laundering money that way. Those cases aren't workable by any one small agency. The by far the best way we can take action to interrupt these opponent networks is by feeding all of this information into a fairly centralized uh, uh, place so that it can be analyzed correctly, if that makes sense.
No, that's an example, right? The money laundering aspect. Because I,
Mhm.
for example, I've were one of those, a lot of the I saw was car dealerships,
Mhm.
right? And that's the conversation, and the counties and how do they look at it and everything. And you would be surprised of how often major drug operations, right, have been
Mhm.
busted because of just a simple traffic stop. It was
Right.
like that one single event because they knew what was going on or something happened led to a multi-agency operation
Mhm.
that disrupted a major drug trafficking organization inside the United States, right? And that's the key
Yep.
aspect. So having an understanding of what to look for
Mhm.
enables you to have a better understanding and understand, is the situation I'm walking into, is this something that is just more of the standard type of crime, or is there something much more broader into this
Mhm.
that maybe meets the eye?
Right. Exactly. Something I was trying to teach when I was a patrol commander was every traffic stop is an opportunity to gather intelligence. We in our agency we have a guy who deals with the outside agencies. He's very good at it, with spreading that information, and just it wasn't an attempt to convince the patrolmen to do it. It was they didn't understand why it was important. Every traffic stop, every bit of information that we can gather and document in some sort of coherent way, we never know when it's going to be useful. So identifying who's with whom and who all's in the car and what dope did we find where and who had it and what cash was there and what guns were there, all of that information being kind of coalesced into a coherent manner. um, we never know within the networks that we're able to build where that will be useful to someone. We may make a traffic stop on a known dirtbag to us that some little piece of detail that we can't identify ahead of time is super important to a much larger network that another agency is investigating.
Can I give
So
you like an example of something
please.
for that? And I think this is like a key aspect of why it's very important to have those conversations with higher organizations and
Mhm.
agencies, specifically like let's say the HIEDAs. So one of the things I track a lot, obviously, in cartel social media is kind of when they do drug laboratories and stuff like that.
Right.
They're very rudimentary. I think
Mhm.
people, when you're talking about drug labs inside of Mexico, people think like Breaking Bad,
Right.
these mega lab, for the most part now, 99%
No.
of them not like that. They're in the
No.
middle of nowhere or
Mhm.
and they're super rudimentary because at the end of the day, they
Mhm.
just care about quantity, not anything else. But one of the key aspects when you're looking at these drugs, is specifically when you're looking at cocaine or others of a similar nature, is the markings,
Mhm.
or either the markings they have inside of the brick of the cocaine
Mhm.
or the packaging.
Right.
Right, a lot of times these drugs have markings, and some of them are like tongue in cheek to try to make fun.
Mhm.
They're kind of trolling. Like I've seen
Right.
drug packaging that has the marking of the Tesla logo. Like
Mhm.
obviously that's
Yeah.
cheap, but in the others, for example, there was one I remember I was tracking a guy in Sonora,
Mhm.
and he had the brick of cocaine in the video that I saw that I later uploaded on my account on Twitter had 08. And why that's
Mhm.
significant is because 08 was one of the, used to be historically a leader of Los Chapitos, one of the factions of
Mhm.
the Sinaloa cartel, specifically a sub faction called Delta Pelones, the Delta
Mhm.
Pelones. And his call sign was 08, and generally that he was associated with the emoji, the 8 ball of pool, right?
Mhm.
And so he had bricks with the markings of 08. And I say that because, again, anybody can have any markings and can be anything, but that's kind of one of the main reasons. Like, especially if you have a situation where you actually find bricks of cocaine and they have a marking, I am telling you right now, the DEA is going to have an huge interest on that type of information, right? And you want to, then it feeds into that information and that better understanding of, is this a route specifically being used by this drug trafficking organization? And I think if your listeners kind of pay attention, I said the word emoji. If you know, that is a huge thing that cartels leverage on their social media, right? They have emojis that are associated with one cartel, and actually, that's how a lot of times I know who is what they're saying or who's who in the zoo. If you see, if I know the state where they uploaded it, they generally will put emojis without any comments on their social media, so it doesn't get taken down by the algorithm. But those emojis are the identifiers, and so when you kind of track cartels, and there's a lot of accounts that, you know, really focus on the Mexican cartels, the tracking of the emojis is the way that we know and can identify which faction, sub-faction, cartel that they belong to, because that's how they kind of communicate. And that's something else that we kind of see within cartel propaganda. The symbology of cartel propaganda is something that is very, very, very important key, and how they communicate and leverage online propaganda and social media.
Yeah, you led me to two super interesting questions there. Number one, if we can get into phones, is it important for us, do you think, to create a separate type of documentation just for emojis, especially in traffickers' phones? I assume you think that's important. Um, and also, well, if you don't mind asking that, and then I've got an analogy.
So I would say so, because, you know, a lot of times when people are talking about, a lot of it goes back to gang tattoos, right? And, you know, we have that history of gang tattoo. And obviously, I mean, the problem you're going to run into, obviously, from the emoji perspective, right? I mean, it's kind of like, is this really a cartel? Or it's just what, you know, just because they're emojis, everybody uses it, right?
Right.
And so, you know, it's unlike a gang tattoo, which is a much more clear, permanent identifier, right? And all the things, like, for example, you know, if you see a skinhead, a white skinhead with 88 tattooed into him, okay, you know, he's a neo-Nazi. Like, we know that. Like, you can't fool anybody. We know how that works. Or a little bit harder because of the kind of the things that it's easy to do. But yes, I would say that because, you know, and again, when you're analyzing it, you know, in Mexico specifically, that's where you see it a lot. When I've tracked cartel members, Mexican cartel members in the United States via social media, they also use a lot of those emojis on digital. Yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be, I don't think, on necessarily the usage of the phones. It's more what they post on social media.
I gotcha.
Right, and because it kind of fits with, that's how they operate, that's how they do it. And if you do exploitation, let's say, of a cell phone device, you know, it's also not only their social media, but kind of their messenger, because a lot of times what they'll do is on their social media. So let's say you're a human trafficker, or you're a drug trafficker based in Mexico, right? You're either affiliated with the cartel, you kind of operate independently. One of the tactics that I see them use regularly, not only in Mexico and the US, but also in Europe and North Africa, there's a huge network of these. And a lot of these accounts are kind of tied one into another. They follow Instagram, ironically.
Right.
What they do is, one, they generally use kind of like these emojis, especially if you're talking about Mexico, so you can kind of identify who they belong to. But the key thing that they always try, it's kind of like a marketing aspect. Like, look at our ability, look at our drugs, look at our ability to smuggle it. You know, now reach out to us so that, you know, we can sell you a product, right? And then they get you, then, you know, you click a link. Generally, that link takes you to Telegram or WhatsApp. And then that way you can have a conversation to buy drugs. And the same with human smuggling, right? On TikTok, for example, there's a lot of accounts on TikTok, and they know how to manipulate the algorithms to ensure that they're not taken down again because of the emojis. And what they'll upload videos of, look how successful we are invading border patrol, right? Or local law enforcement. We're operating. Reach out to us and we can get you across the border, right? And so those are the types of things. And yes, and one of the key ways you can identify them is by the emojis they use. And, you know, this is something that I've been really streaming about for years. There's a lot of other accounts that focus on Mexican cartels. For example, Pernicious Propaganda. He's also on X. Latam Obscuro, also on X. You know, they've done multiple threads, and I coordinated with them on this cartel emoji thing. And I think it's finally slowly starting to get picked up by more, you know, mainstream media. There's this understanding that this is how they do it, right? And it's a different thing. And that's the area that I would be much more interested in. Now, obviously, to check social media, that's a little bit maybe outside of the scope of just a normal traffic stop per se, but you would be surprised even sometimes how they might a lot of the emojis and kind of this not necessarily sometimes not necessarily emojis, but the symbology,
Mm-hmm.
how they openly display it and how they actually wear and buy clothes that
Mm-hmm.
are associated with the cartel. So for example, there's a store that sells hats,
Mm-hmm.
very active on Instagram, that sells hats associated with the Maito Fracos, which is again is a faction of the Sinaloa cartel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very key because it's like a black hat, it's gold, and has a horse, because the horse is kind of the symbol of Maito Fraco, the leader, and they
Mm-hmm.
have MF, which is his acronyms, right? And so if you kind of know, and again, not
Mm-hmm.
one in a million chance that in a traffic stop you see
Mm-hmm.
that and he's wearing an MF hat,
Mm-hmm.
like if I'm like, okay, like I'm getting your
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, got it. This is a traffic stop, but I'm getting this information. I'm sending it up. He had this, this, right? Because at that point, why are you wearing? You're
Right.
finding that close because you know exactly what it means. You cannot claim
Mm-hmm.
ignorance. There's only one place where you can buy it. You have to put the term specifically related to the cartel to buy it. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
it. You
Right.
can't claim ignorance. And so then that is kind of what a lot of things. Like the other one, for example, those Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo,
Mm-hmm.
the other faction of the Sinaloa cartel, they go by pizza.
Mm-hmm.
So they use a lot of pizza symbology in a lot of the things they do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so those are the types of, now again, the pizzas are much more common, so it's a little bit hard, but that's kind of the areas what you're looking
Mm-hmm.
for, right? That's kind of the indications. Is this somebody that might be much more, and again, these are generally at the higher echelons of the drug cartel, not necessarily at the gang level, but just as gangs have tattoos and we all are accustomed and understand how that
Mm-hmm.
operates, the same applies for cartels, but a lot of times there's much more kind of the symbology, the emojis, etc. Jalisco New Generation cartel, it's the rooster or the chicken.
Mm-hmm.
That's because they're mental, right? That's the leader,
Right.
is identifier. And so those are the types of things that you have to look for.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's kind of hard, but those are the things that would be kind of comparable to the gang tattoos.
But they can at least be an indicator to
Exactly.
dig.
Exactly.
To dig.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that. This is reminding me where Mexico is today, especially in relation to the Department of War and the agency and all the work they're doing to counter the cartels. Reminds me a lot of the warlord period of China. The way that Mexico is operating is very similar to, I know this is kind of off topic, but I spent a lot of time because I'm a weirdo, to study that history of the warlord period of China, and it's eerily similar, and I'm sure it has to do with how large societies of humans interact with one another given a certain set of circumstances. Like it's not copying warlordism. It's just it seems to be eerily similar to how that works or how that worked back in the day.
It's an interesting comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, different reasons why they're
Right.
like. I think that's not yes in a way because I haven't if you look at the cartel control maps, like the cartel maps that really think tanks release about the territorial control, it's oversimplified.
Right.
So there's an account that has a website called Active Cartel Maps in Mexico. And in my YouTube channel, if you look at it, there's a link. Go to any place with the description. And if you click on it, that's the best map. And what he highlights and the way he built it really shows the complexity of it. Right? Because it literally looks like if you look at the warlord era in China, like all these little different colors and all these, and in many ways, that's exactly what Mexico is. And by the way, it goes much more than that, right? Because you might have a cartel. So, for example, in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, which borders McAllen, Texas, right? There's a group called those Metros, the Metro. Now, the Metros is a faction of the Gulf Cartel, right? So the Sinaloa Cartel, the Gulf Cartel are in active civil war, so they've broken as a singular cartel. They don't exist anymore, right? So the Metros are a faction of the Gulf Cartel that have been fighting the Scorpion group out of Matamoros, which borders Brownsville, Texas. Another Gulf Cartel faction, right? They've been bowing out. Now there's kind of like this ceasefire in place between both. They had a very violent civil war. But a lot of the people, the cartel observers would look at the metros and be like, we know they had an alliance with the Jalisco New Generation cartel, right?
Mhm.
Madera Gulf cartel faction. What's interesting is that the Treasury Department earlier this year sanctioned key leaders of that faction because of fuel theft and selling stolen fuel and oil from Mexico to the United States. But when you read the sanctions, they said the leader of the Metros, wasn't a leader of a Gulf cartel faction in Tamaulipas that had an alliance with CGNG. They said, no, he is CGNG in Tamaulipas, meaning that the Metros is CGNG in Tamaulipas. They just have an alliance. And that adds to the complexity of the nature when you're analyzing, because some of these are fronts of these groups, some of these have an alliance, some of these are absorbed, some of these are tiers, some of them splinter. And if you look at the map, I think that is obviously different reasons for fighting, different historical context.
Right.
Overall, just as I said, the example, if you're looking at the violence in Mexico, you have to look at the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, obviously different political motivations, but the way they're fighting is very much more similar to that than just gang violence, let's say, in any American town in the United States. Same with your said, it is that. And it's all these different groups vying and fighting for each other. What I would say, and again, kind of just one of the interesting aspects now, what we're seeing in Mexico is this possibility that instead of generally we see violence skyrocket because of fracturing. What we're actually now, the interesting aspect from a theoretical perspective, if I may put my little academic hat, don't hate me. What we're actually seeing in Mexico right now, what I find fascinating, is that violence is going up because of a consolidations.
Right.
What we're seeing right now is because of the Sinaloa cartel civil war between the Maito Flacos and los Chapitos, right? The Chapitos were losing. They have an alliance with Jalisco New Generation cartel, which was their historical rival. That alliance, when it was officially announced earlier this year, fundamentally transformed the cartel landscape in Mexico. And now what you're seeing the rival do is he's responding to that alliance with his own. And so now it's a very interesting conversation are we starting to see two basic major blocks form across Mexico, battling each other out? Because historically, when you saw blocks form, it was very local, central, and like in this one specific state or locality. Now we're actually running into a possibility that it's two major blocks forming that are battling across Mexico. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting there, where cartels are starting to have these, forming the lines, almost like a Cold War-esque, right? The Soviet Union, the United States. Think of it that way, but in a and that's something that I think is a very interesting dynamic in Mexico going right now. But it fits within your construct of this warlordism in China. I think that's a very apt, comparison to what's going on in Mexico right now.
Yeah, I think so too. I've been tracking that as well. I don't know this, but I suspect that they are concerned about kinetic responses given the executive orders of their designations from our president. And I wonder if they're trying to consolidate strength for defense in their minds by consolidating these smaller groups together to be able to defend themselves.
I wouldn't look
more
at it
thoroughly.
I don't know. No.
You don't think that has any?
It's not the U.S. Okay, let me put this way. Okay, so the I haven't really seen the cartels really respond to Trump, right? The consolidations that we're seeing is more directly tied to the Sinaloa cartel civil war. And again, it's not widespread yet, and a lot of the violence is still happening. But generally, again, the cartels still view other cartels as their main rivals. And the argument that I would even say is cartel members understand that the death of a leader or the capture of a drug or whatever is just a business loss. They bake that in, even the death of a leader, right? And the interesting aspect, the irony is that we've seen unilateral operations that the U.S. has done under the Biden administration, right? The reason why the Sinaloa cartel civil war happened is because the most powerful drug lord, probably in history, Miles Zapata, people call him the right-hand man of El Chapo. Let's be real. Miles Zapata was the power base of the Sinaloa cartel, much more than El Chapo. El Chapo had the name recognition, but if you're really going to look at it, it was Miles Zapata. The Biden administration did an operation that captured him in Mexico using one of El Chapo's son as an informant, tricked Miles Zapata into a plane and flew him into the U.S. right?
Mm-hmm.
A unilateral operation. It just wasn't SEAL Team 6. From what I've read, FBI operation that managed to trick him and get him in, and that's what caused the Civil War. But what the interesting aspect that happened was Maito Franco didn't declare war on the U.S. He declared war on Los Chapitos, and that's how you have to analyze them. Because in the end of the day, let's be absolutely clear. I don't believe we're in a situation even if the Trump administration authorizes direct action against cartels, drone strike, special forces, it's going to be persistent all the time, 24/7, like Iraq, Syria during ISIS, or A2nd is going to go into Mexico and seize it. That's not going to happen. And it's not going to have that much of an impact, even if you sorry guys, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if you send in the military to seize 30 kilometers and try to create a buffer zone in northern Mexico, drugs are still going to come in because they come through legal traffic and trade. Like, what are we talking about? It's not going to do anything, right?
So, and I suspect that's why we haven't seen that style of large scale kinetics.
But
I suspect.
I mean, it's also Mexico's our largest trading partner.
Right.
If you're fighting China, you really want to screw over your largest trading partner, and by the way, which would cause enormous economic harm in the U.S. Right? Cartel with your Meyer I have not seen a reason why they would change their opinion. Their biggest concern are rival cartels, and so the consolidation of these cartels has much more to do with that than anything else. And let's be absolutely real: the United States, for example, if we're really talking about it, and I've alluded to this in other episodes that have been reported. The United States is never going to have the political will to really address the Mexican cartel problems. And a perfect example of this, we were talking about money laundering, right? Just one cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. One of the key financial leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel is a guy named El Cuini. That's his nickname. El Cuini has been in Mexican prison for the longest time until he was extradited during the Trump administration. Right now, he was extradited to the U.S. If you were to remove every single dollar that El Cuini has touched from the Mexican financial sector, like if the U.S. really wanted to sanction the shit out of it and remove every single dollar that was in the financial market related to Queenie, the Mexican economy collapses overnight.
Right. And which we don't want, right?
Exactly. So, and so that's the thing. I know we're kind of going a little bit in the broader aspect, but I think it's an important.
No, that's good.
Yeah, because it's just that's the reality of it. That's the problem. And even when we're talking about drugs, and understandably, that's the issue that a lot of cops are going to focus on because it's just the clear thing. But I've had conversations. Again, they've smuggled avocados, lime, water. They have ways of making money and through extortion in the jellyfish business, oil, pesticides.
Right.
They smuggle pesticides, and that's the thing, right? And that would actually be another recommendation I would have for these law enforcement guys in these small town cops, don't be, and this is where maybe the hiatus, I don't know, I haven't really been in a hiatus in a long, long time, right? So I don't know if they managed to update their business model, but one of the key things that I would ask is are we seeing any other types of goods being smuggled in this area that is not necessarily drugs? Because avocados is a huge business opportunity for a cartel. Pesticides, and some of them are cartels, some of them are just independent crime networks in Mexico that are trying to make an easy money. But that's the other thing. Look what other products might be smuggled in, because we always look at drugs and people, but there's a lot more, and that's south to north. And then the other question is, am I seeing anything going north to south, money or weapons?
Right.
And it enables you to broaden out, because if the problem we're talking about cartels is that they become so singular, I think, focused on the drug piece, that we completely miss this much more expensive business model that these cartels operate and how they really leverage it to do, in the end of the day, what they care about most, which is make money.
Right. I like that broadening of vision, because you're right. I mean, they don't exist to smuggle drugs. They exist to make money. And if all we are focusing in on is the drugs, which is the cheapest probably for them to make, I would assume, and they have the biggest lost accountability, they account for whatever it is. I hear different numbers, but it's everywhere from 10 to 30%. They just assume off the top is going to be lost. Are they doing that as a loss lead to allow the other stuff in that we can educate ourselves on as small town cops, to everything from being able to read a manifest on a semi truck. Like, we don't teach cops to do that.
Here's another example, right? And because then, again, I go back to something I said earlier, and I think this is important. And again, you would be surprised, right? So one of the comments I made was in Europe, we're seeing an increase of cartel members, specifically, I would say probably the Sinaloa cartel in Europe. And I've also seen a holistic new generation cartel do this in India and in Africa. What we're seeing is now probably an increase of them trying to establish drug laboratories in the host country. Right. So the two cases that I mentioned of the Sinaloa cartel in Europe, one was in Poland and one was in France. Both of those raids that occurred were in very remote, small town areas. Both of them very small town, right? What would be interesting to see is, again, are we seeing that same example in the United States? Because we do know, obviously, Americans maybe have nothing to do with cartel members are doing it themselves, right? They want to make money, they want to do it. And that's a huge business opportunity for a lot of just local criminals in the United States that are American citizens that have no affiliation with the cartel. But that's something that I'm interested in is do we start seeing either cartel members leveraging already existing drug laboratories through a partnership or trying to establish their own drug laboratories in the United States to do, to kind of manufacture and not necessarily rely so much so on just the shipment of drugs and the risk of it getting interdicted across the border, right? The other thing that I think is also important to highlight is like just, from a narcotics perspective, when the United States, a lot of states legalized marijuana, right? We did see smuggling of marijuana across the border plummeted. Right. The illegal marijuana farming just shipped north. Right. Right. And it's especially in a lot of those remote areas. And that's something like that's another example within the drug manufacturing. We're seeing a huge increase of illegal marijuana being done inside the United States. And ProPublica had a great report on this, kind of highlighting the threat. And one of the things they found out during their investigation was it was the Chinese triads where the most to benefit from this, and even all the way from Oklahoma, right? And do that. And so those are the types of thing where I think it goes back to this overall general conversation of why small cops should kind of, get involved in higher organizations, either HIATAs, FBI, DEA, state, or other local communities and counties have conversation. Because at the end of the day, each locality, each county, each town has a different problem set. And unless you're cross-talking and leveraging the existing organizations, that's whole job is to inform people, to have a better, you might not know what you're looking at because, again, I'm a cartel guy, right? I focus on Mexican cartels, but is your locality something that has a problem set with the Chinese triads? Right? Yeah. Marijuana in Oklahoma, because I knew ProPublica laid it all out. In Oklahoma, illegal marijuana was dominated by the triads there, right? In Oklahoma, right? And so that's kind of the conversation that I think why it's important to have it. Because if you don't necessarily would know exactly what you're looking for. Every single community is different. There might be similarities, right? Different. Every community has its own different problems, and it has to be addressed one way or another.
I like that way of thinking about it because that can drive, if we can develop those relationships, we can begin identifying what we need to train ourselves better on whether it's chemical recognition or manifest analysis on the street or human interactions and identifying a thread for networks, like whatever is going to best serve your local community. The only way to identify that and focus your training effort on that is to get to know and develop relationships with these other folks, not only in your region, but in your state and the region of states. Because like you said, otherwise we're walking through a forest that's on fire and we're squirting water on a particular tree. We're not fighting the entire fire. As long as we keep focusing or keeping our horizon too low, if that makes sense, helping us identify the things that we can be working on.
Exactly. Like if you were to talk about Mexico, right, I can lay it all out.
Right.
And even if I were to do it in Mexico, that would be the key aspect that you would start noticing, because it goes back to how I opened it up. It's multiple conflicts and different problem sets. And a lot of times let's say the violence in Michoacan, which is the Mexican
Mm-hmm.
Pacific, as I alluded to with the avocados,
Mm-hmm.
that conflict really has no commonality really with the violence in Tamaulipas, which is a state of Mexico in the northeast that borders Texas. Right? Those
Right.
conflicts had nothing to do with one another.
Right.
And
Not even the same people at a high level, right?
exactly. Two
Yeah.
completely separate organizations
Right.
is doing the violence. And that's the thing. So if that's even inside of Mexico, the same with the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the situation that maybe might be impacting, let's say, California, Washington, Oregon, New York, Vermont, and Maine had nothing to do with Kansas, North Dakota, Wisconsin, et cetera. And I think that's the issue that and a lot of those at times that when we're talking, like I said, we've seen an increase of drug laboratories in Europe. So, and is that a trend we might see in the United States? Right, that's something to look into.
Mm-hmm.
Highways, again. I mean, that's the key. You want to understand what is the kind of the main mode of transportation for drugs in the United States: interstate highways. But I mean, a lot of those interstate highways are right next to small town cops that they may or may not have the jurisdiction over. Right, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the key aspect where
matters.
And how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. And there's some agencies that have really leaned into that. There's one in Arkansas in particular that I'm thinking about, right on the same interstate highway that we're on I-40. They focused on this about 6 or 7 years ago and have really done God's work with their little 5-mile section of I-40. They're just tearing it up. But they did that by networking, understanding what problem sets they had passing through, and then identifying the indicators that they need to be looking for, and they trained themselves to do it. And they're doing phenomenal work. And they're a tiny agency, like 3 full-time guys, right? They can make a very serious impact just by doing a real analysis and figuring out what the problems are for their particular jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's super helpful. Your advice is super helpful. Stefano, we really appreciate you, man. We can't wait to have you on again. Where can, I know you already said it once, but people who made it all the way through, where can folks can they follow you? Primarily on X, right?
Yeah, I would say all source news. So it's all underscore source underscore news. And then the other one for my company is either at Artorias Tech, or the other one that we use is at sitrep underscore Artorias. Those are the main ones that we operate. And John, this was great. I mean, I always like, having these types of conversations and try to make the analysis and give a perspective that is valuable to the person who's looking for. Because as you said, like a small town cop is not probably interested in, even though we got to talk about it, like the overall violence in Mexico, but it's like, well, what's the so what for me? And I think this is, I think it should be my responsibility as somebody who claims, that focus in Mexican cartels and want to be the best at it. It is my, I should be the ones like, well, this is the so what for you and how this problem set is applicable to you. And I really appreciate this because generally people focus a lot of, from an educational purpose, but it's a lot of the big pictures. Yours, it's more, well, make this make sense. And then what can we do to make it better? And what are things that they should look at? And I think that's a phenomenal. So, John, thank you so much. And I'm always down to have any other conversations in any format you wish. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, my friend. I think it's super important for guys to track this stuff. They don't spend all your day on it, but you do need to be tracking this stuff because it does affect us locally. Guys, we appreciate you very much. Find us at TF70.org. If you're willing to support the mission of the foundation, which is to train rural and small town cops who don't get training any other way, find us at TF70.org/donate. All we're asking for is $20 a month. Guys, we really appreciate you. And until next time, I'm Chappie for the Task Force 70 Foundation. Thanks.